I'm glad we're back, and we are jumping into Revelation 2. There's one item reader or listeners may recall. We skipped the death in Hades part of Revelation 1, and we're going to pick that up when we hit that phrase again later, which I, of course, when we were going through Revelation 1, I mentioned that, but just to mention it here again. So we're moving right into chapter 2, and we'll wait to pick up the whole death in Hades thing, which I think people are going to find real interesting. But for today, it's really the first 7 verses. I don't know. I think next time we'll probably just finish the whole chapter, but for right now, the first 7 verses, which I'm going to read, and then we'll jump into it. Again, our point here is, how does the Old Testament get repurposed? How does the Old Testament contribute to what we're reading, understanding what we're reading? So this is the letter to the church in Ephesus. It's the first 7 verses, and I'm reading ESV. It says, "To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles, and are not, and found them to be false. I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent, and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. Yet this you have, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." So, there are lots of things we could sort of point out here. There's the reference to my name's sake, which ties in with the name theology. Again, we've spent a good bit of time on name theology in the podcast, so I'm not going to dig in there at all. We could. It's very obvious, the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand. Again, this is ostensibly the source, the origin point of the message, and this is Jesus, who we've seen in prior lessons here, prior episodes, is identified with God. And then at the very end here in verse 7, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So now the Spirit is the one giving the message. Well, is it the Spirit? Is it Jesus who is God, or God? And the answer is, yep. Again, this is you get another one of these indications where, this is the sort of thing where Trinitarian thought comes from, this co-identification. And again, we've spent a lot of time on that in other books and, different ways. So I want to focus on some different things here that actually have some sort of specific root in the Old Testament that we haven't, spent so much time with, in earlier episodes or other episodes of the podcast or even my books. So before we do that, though, I think it's probably reasonable, since we've had several interviews in between here, to kind of review where we've been. To this point in the series, we've discussed Revelation 1, except for verse 18. That's the keys of death and Hades reference, and we'll get to that later when we get into chapter 3. We've looked at 7 spirits or stars or angels identified with 7 churches. This is all Revelation 1. And the term lampstands is looped into that. The 7 churches are identified as these lampstands per Revelation 1:20. We've seen Jesus, the glorified Son of Man, is in their midst. That's Revelation 1:13. And we looked at how the exalted Son of Man figure comes from Daniel 7, familiar passage to this audience, where the Son of Man gets the deity epithet, the one who rides on the clouds or comes with the clouds. In that chapter, again, Daniel 7 has the Ancient of Days with the hair and clothing white as snow and pure wool, with a throne of fire. But Revelation 1, attributes that imagery also to the Son of Man, where Daniel 7 doesn't do that. Daniel 7 has these 2 characters, Ancient of Days, Son of Man. Revelation 1, John merges them. And we talked about why John does that, and again, to identify Jesus and God and so on and so forth. So Jesus, we have in Revelation 1, God is man in the midst of the 7 spirits and the stars, the 7, angels identified with the 7 churches. Now, the lampstands, again, point to churches, but we've also seen in earlier episodes that the 7 lamps, 7 lampstands, really lamps, menorah branches, are an allusion to Zechariah 4, 1 and 2, where we have one standing lamp with 7 branches. Again, the classic menorah figure. These 7 lights, these 7 lamps in Zechariah, are further identified in Zechariah 4, verse 10 as, quote, the eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth. And we've seen in earlier episodes that these are divine beings. This is divine council imagery, members of the heavenly host. We looked at Eric and Carol Myers, their commentary on Haggai and Zechariah 1-8 for that, where they talk about the eyes of Yahweh being language that's used of God's omniscience and omnipresence. And that's true, but there's more to it, because how is God described as doing that, keeping tabs on everything? Well, that's through the agency of the members of the heavenly host, which gets you into the heavenly books idea that God has agents that travel to and fro throughout the whole earth as the eyes of the Lord, keeping tabs, keeping track of everything that's going on. And we looked at A. Leo Oppenheim's article on that very subject, The Eyes of the Lord, from the Journal of the American Oriental Society back in 1968. This is all episode 355. So these are the paths that we've gone through or down. And so to try to simplify here, the eyes of the Lord, again, yes, it's an expression of God's omniscience, but the extension of that omniscience seems to be that the eyes of the Lord are his heavenly agents. And the churches, the angels, the lampstands, again, all this language is bound together. You can't really talk about one of these things, the churches, the angels, or the lampstands, without talking about the others. They are different yet inextricably linked, by the language. Now, all of that's necessary in terms of review because of a line we're going to encounter later in Revelation 2, the message for the church at Ephesus. So, again, let's jump back into Revelation 2 and the first line, to the angel of the church in Ephesus write. So, ostensibly, John is instructed to write to this angel, whatever that is. Now, the language here is why some interpreters think the angels are the pastors or the human leaders of these churches. John's writing a letter to that guy, or whoever. Now, that might sound right, but it's actually problematic. And you probably have already sensed that because of the identification of the angels and the lampstands and the churches and the stars. Can you really neatly separate the people in the church from the church collectively, from the eyes of the Lord? I mean, how do you parcel these things out? And the answer is you can't really do it neatly. They're inextricably linked, even though they're different things. You can't really talk about one without talking about the others. So that's the general problem. To this point, when writing about churches up until chapter 2, there's been no mention by John of specific human leadership, only supernatural guardians or supervision. Again, the eyes of the Lord. Recall again that John associates the menorah light branches, the lampstands, with the angels, spirits, and the churches. And that association, plus the supernatural nature of the eyes of the Lord, strongly suggests that the angels of the churches are not human leaders. That's the other side. Now, in his Revelation commentary, Owen writes this. He says, the term angelos, angel messenger, occurs 77 times in Revelation in both singular and plural forms. Only 8 of these references are problematic, those that refer to, quote, the angels of the 7 churches. That's Revelation 1:20. And the 7 occurrences of the singular term angelos as the particular addressee of each of the 7 proclamations to the churches. The first one we've run into here is Revelation 2:1, but there's others, throughout these 2 chapters. Since most of the 69 occurrences, that are left of the term angelos or angeloi, that's the plural, refer to benevolent supernatural beings who serve as mediators and messengers between God and his creation, Owen notes, most scholars therefore presume the 8 problematic references must also refer to beneficent supernatural beings. Again, to shorten that up, you got 77 occurrences, 69 of them are not ambiguous. They're supernatural beings. The only ones that aren't are when the term is linked to the churches here. So on saying, well, look, odds are pretty good that maybe we're better off, looking at the angel of the church in, fill in the blank is also a supernatural being. Now, in my angels book, I also note that the notion of supernatural agents assigned to or watching over churches is quite possibly a New Testament adaptation of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Now, I have to stop here and say, if you're listening to the podcast, maybe you just started listening to the podcast and you have no idea what the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is, I can't go through it here. On the front page of the podcast, there's a tab or a button at the top that says Start Here, and there's a video explaining what the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is. So again, back to the angels book. In that book, I discuss the angels to the churches issue, and one of the suggestions is that we may have a New Testament adaptation of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Specifically, within that worldview, you have the nations other than Israel assigned to lesser sons of God, lesser Elohim, and they become corrupt and so on and so forth. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, this is all old news to you. And so all the nations besides Israel that God disinherits at Babel are under dominion of some other supernatural beings. And this is where, the Old Testament, the Old Testament explains why there are other gods of the nations and where we get pantheons and all this kind of stuff for these nations. Israel, though, prior to the book of Daniel, Israel is Yahweh's property. This is his domain. It's his inheritance, all right? It's his possession. It's the nation he takes, according to Deuteronomy 4:19 through 20, for his own. Now, in the book of Daniel, we read, and there are scholars speculate on why this is. I'm not going to go down this bunny trail too far. But in the book of Daniel, we learn that Michael, again, one specific angel, who is one of the chief princes. Michael is the guardian, if you will, of Israel. And some people think that this is because God is sort of distance here because of the exile and all this kind of stuff. And this is why, Israel now has a placeholder like all the other nations, and it's not directly with God because it's another way to communicate Israel in exile. Again, I'm not going to go down that bunny trail too far, but this is the situation you get in Daniel. And so the idea of a supernatural being assigned a guardianship or a supervisory role of the people of God is a biblical one. When you get into the New Testament, what you have is you don't have the people of God associated with one geographical place or entity, a national Israel. You have the people of God scattered everywhere in little groups called churches. And so the notion that you would have a church playing some sort of guardianship role or, again, supervisory role, it very well could be a New Testament adaptation of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And I think in this case, because elsewhere angel is clearly a supernatural being, and also because the angels of the churches are tied in with the lampstand imagery, which are the eyes of the Lord, which are clearly supernatural beings, I think this is probably the best way to go. So that I'm sort of fronting where I'm going to go with all this, so that you kind of are able to track with me early on. Now, I also noted in the angels book that the answer, again, to this question, are the angels human leaders or supernatural agents, is ultimately answered. I think, this is a big element to bring alongside the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, that it's ultimately answered by the grammar of Revelation 1 through 3 in the immediate context of each letter. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's use Revelation 2 and Ephesus as an example. This will be a little more detailed than what you might find in the angels book. So again, just heads up. So we have here Revelation 2:1. To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. Now, if you notice, the angel is addressed. The Lord tells John to tell the angel, whoever or whatever that is, that the message is coming from God, or Jesus, the one with the stars in his hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. Again, this is divine council, heavenly throne room imagery. None of that means anything to a human leader. If a human leader is being addressed, it makes less sense to sort of loop the human into that picture or that imagery or remind them of that imagery, as opposed to if we have a supernatural being that this is the headquarters place, okay? This is where you were tasked. If the addressee is an angel, in other words, one of these lampstands, there's 7 lampstands, remember? The 7 churches. Ephesus is the first one. So Jesus walks among these lampstands, who again are the eyes of the Lord, which is, again, divine council members and so on and so forth. It just doesn't seem to fit a human being. But if this is a supernatural being, all the imagery makes sense. The language makes sense. If the addressee is an angel, one of the 7 lampstands, or one of the stars that are with the lampstands, so on and so forth, that would be in concert with the Zechariah material, okay, Zechariah 4. I would also say we don't have to think of the semantic of the phrase "to the angel," right, to the angel, as speaking of a literal recipient. It's not like John's writing a letter and he's going to go hand it to an angel. Okay, that's an over-literalism that doesn't make any sense on one hand and isn't necessary on the other. You could read the phrase as this. You could read it this way. The Lord tells John to write concerning the angel of the church in Ephesus, or in regard to, or with respect to the angel of the church in Ephesus. Okay, those are semantic options that don't require John literally handing off a letter to a supernatural being. Okay? The wording loops in the angel, though, with what follows. And I think that's important. And what follows are comments about the state of the church in Ephesus, the group of human believers that the angel is overseeing, or at least watching, keeping tabs on. So verse 2, I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. Now, all of these things are what you'd expect Jesus to say to human believers who are struggling to remain loyal to Jesus. The pronouns used here, your works, your toil, your patient endurance, and then verbs, you have tested, you are enduring, all this stuff. They're all grammatically singular. So you would ask, well, doesn't that mean that we have to opt for John writing to a human leader of the church at Ephesus because the verbs here are singular? The answer is no. Singular Greek grammatical forms are used of collective entities, in this case, churches. I'm suggesting here that the Lord instructs John to write things in his book in regard to the believing community, which is overseen by a supernatural agent, akin to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where Michael was God's agent in spiritual warfare over his people. At that time, it was one community called Israel. Now it's churches. So you see, if you look at it that way, it blends the supernatural aspect, okay, a supernatural being overseeing this congregation, and it also loops in the church collectively. And by the way, it doesn't make it really any sense to have one individual, one leader, one pastor as the subject of your works, your toil, your patient endurance. It's not just one guy that's being commended. It's a whole church. It's a collective entity. And likewise, when churches get blamed for things, it's not just one person. It's them collectively. So how do we merge the collective sense, this evaluation? Because all these letters are going to be evaluatory of these churches. How do we, loop the collective sense of what is being said to these churches, the entity, the body, the congregation, with this angel? And again, I think the best way, I'll just say it again, I think the best way to merge them together is that God is instructing John to write things in Revelation in regard to the whole church, the believing community, which is overseen by a supernatural agent, an angel, akin to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. I think that's the easiest way to marry these two things together and make sense of the language. Let's go to verse 4. But I have this against you, and that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the works you did at first. Well, I think verses 4 and 5 make the perspective I just sketched out pretty clear. These are all singulars again, against you. You have abandoned the love. You have fallen. Repent, a singular command. To me, it defies credibility to think that the point of this language is for one is for, either one supernatural agent assigned to the church that they're getting blamed, or one human pastor. Rather, it's one group that is getting evaluated here, the church, which is at, Ephesus, okay? I think Revelation 2 begins very clearly. I mean, who does it say that the letter is actually and ultimately to? It's to the angel of the church in Ephesus, right? Okay, so we've got the angel, the supernatural guardian, and the church collectively. So how do we marry those two things together? To me, it just makes little sense to say that one human being is being isolated out as the recipient of this letter and getting the credit or the blame. And it just doesn't make very, very good sense for me. To me, on the other hand, it makes good sense for the singulars to be pointing to the body of believers at Ephesus, the whole church, that they need to, here's what you're doing well, here's what you're not doing well. Now we get to this line. Okay, he says, repent, do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. So what is the threat? There's a twofold aspect to this. Since the lampstand and its star, or its angel, are inextricably linked, again, because of the lampstand imagery in Revelation applying to the church, but in the Old Testament being used of supernatural beings. Again, these things are merged. You have to look at this in two ways. There's a twofold aspect to this. The lampstand, the star are linked. Okay, the church and its angel are inextricably linked. The church and its supernatural guardian, you can't really distinguish them neatly and separate them. Basically, if the church at Ephesus doesn't get its act together, the Lord is going to recall its lampstand, its supernatural agent, its guardianship. That's the threat. We're going to call this guy home, which means the church's effective presence in the world. I mean, if the angel here is supposed to be a helper or a guardian or an overseer, I mean, all these things, angels do lots of things, okay? The threat to say, well, I guess your work is done here. Come on back. That would be, to me, it's the New Testament church. It's the Revelation 2 equivalent of Judges chapter 2, where the angel of the Lord, in that case, shows up, and says, hey, you failed at the conquest. I'm leaving. You're on your own. I'm out of here. So it has that kind of a flavoring. It's a judgment. For God to remove the guardianship or the angel who is there to assist in some way or observe or whatever the angel is going to do at any given point, is to treat his people at Ephesus as though they are not his. Their job is over. It's a chastening. And by the way, the connection to Israel there should be apparent. I mean, God does do this to his people. He withdraws, his presence. I mean, the glory leaves Israel before the exile. I mean, we're familiar with these passages. And the angel of the Lord in Judges 2 says, I'm out of here. I'm no longer going to lead you. So again, mapping these ideas over to each other, the concepts are not foreign. The concepts are present in the Old Testament. The lampstand, being removed from its place, that is, this supernatural agent will cease to play a role in you people being a kingdom of priests and a priestly witness at Ephesus. I mean, because that's your job. That's your job. And if you think about, again, parallels to Israel again, here we go. Again, it's the Deuteronomy 32 worldview seeping into the New Testament context, okay? When the angel of the Lord leaves, then you get the period of the judges, which is a disaster. And God, he doesn't forget them. He intervenes in a number of places, raises up judges and so on and so forth. But the whole point is that this is going to be even more of a struggle. It's going to be even worse. Okay, so you need to, go back to, quote unquote, your first love. And I think the interpretation of that phrase derives from this discussion. The ESV has, you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Now, this first love imagery certainly has Old Testament echoes. It seems to come from passages like Jeremiah 2. Let me just read that real quickly. Jeremiah 2:2. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem. Thus says the Lord, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness, in a land not sown. Okay, so this first love, this bride, God's bride in the Old Testament. But again, in Judges chapter 2, God, in the form of the angel, says, I'm leaving. You obviously are not, you're not showing allegiance. You're not showing loyalty to me. And again, in the conquest situation, going back to the book of Judges, and that doesn't work well. So they have ceased to, there's a question mark there about are you getting the job done or not? And in Israel's case, no, you're not. Ezekiel 16:8 is another one of these where you get this, love language, this bride language for Israel. When I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine. And it's this marital marriage imagery used of Israel. So a number of scholars think that the first love idea has some attachment to these passages. Beale, in his Revelation commentary, he writes this, and I think appropriately. He notes that the quote-unquote loss of love should not be understood as generally a lack of love for Jesus. Okay, verses 2 and 3 really defy that. Let me read verses 2 and 3, and this is how you'll often hear the passage preached, unfortunately. But verses 2 and 3 pretty much deny it. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil. I mean, they haven't switched sides. But you have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not. Okay, they're not swayed by false teaching. You have found them to be false. I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. I mean, they're believing. They haven't buckled under the threat or the specter of unbelief. That is not what's going on here. Okay, that is not what's going on here. I think Beale is right to point this out. Again, to summarize him, he says the issue isn't that the Ephesian believers are falling away or rethinking their loyalty to Jesus. Again, I'm just summarizing Beale's thoughts. Jeremiah 2:2, Ezekiel 16:8, both have the covenant relationship between God and his bride in view. So if verses 2 and 3 have the Ephesian believers hanging on to their faith, they're not severing from it. They're not going after somebody else. They're not, like committing spiritual adultery or anything like this. They're not succumbing to unbelief. So what's the problem? In what respect are they failing? And Beale, what he does is he directs people his readers to Matthew 24:12-14. He's, given the apocalyptic context of Revelation, Beale brings this passage up, and here's what it says. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The lawlessness referred to in that Matthew passage, again, summarizing Beale's thoughts here, is not the worldliness of believers. Okay, they haven't become worldly, they haven't given up. Rather, the context is the persecution of believers and the deception of believers with false teaching back in Matthew. It is, in a word, opposition from unbelievers. But more importantly, back in Matthew, verse 14 links the love of many tapering off. It links that idea, not with succumbing to heresy or false teaching or worldliness. I mean, they're enduring under that, just like in Revelation 2. Rather, it links the love of many tapering off to God's desire that the gospel be proclaimed throughout the whole world. That's both the reason the church is opposed, but it's also the mission. I mean, Beale suggests that the waning love of the Ephesians is not their own believing loyalty. That's secure, but their lack of witness to the people of Ephesus, to the nations. And if you look at the wording of Revelation 2:4, the antidote to abandoning the love they had at first is to, quote, do the works they did at first. And Beale comments, quote, this explains the loss of love as unfaithfulness to the covenantal task, not the covenantal theology, the belief system, who the true God is. That's not in question. It explains the loss of love as unfaithfulness to the covenantal task of enduring in preaching the gospel for a witness. So I think that to me, that makes sense. It makes sense out of the Matthew passage. It makes sense out of what the church in Ephesus is commended for, but they still lack. Again, you have to take off the table the things that they are certainly not being blamed for. It's not, they don't have a problem with unbelief. They don't have a problem with being duped by false teachers. Yes, they see all that stuff. Yes, they're under persecution, but they're holding up. Okay, they're suffering for the Lord's name's sake and all this kind of stuff. They're holding up. Nevertheless, I have something against you. You've left your, this first love idea. And again, if you go back to the Matthew passage, this idea is linked to taking the gospel to all the nations. And so Beale wants to tie that knot here. And I think that makes sense. I think that's consistent thinking. By way of a modern analogy, let's talk about current events here in the current context. By way of a modern analogy, when our political culture begins to persecute the church in the years to come, and it will come, will your impulse be to bring them to the Lord, to bring your enemies to the Lord, or to get revenge? Is it, well, you're headed for hell, the Lord's going to judge, and he's going to take care of you anyway? That could very possibly, especially in Ephesus. I mean, consider in the book of Acts what happened in Ephesus with Paul and the riots and all this stuff. That could very well be the context of the early church in Ephesus to whom John is writing. They were targets. And Jesus wasn't of the mind to let an attitude that wasn't about winning them over to his family go unchallenged or unchastised. You're here to expand the kingdom, not win an argument, and not be comfortable. The church, again, around the world, we're going to need this message in the years to come. I just know we will. The church around the world is growing. It's growing under persecution. And the church in America needs to follow suit. We're not an exception. And the mandate of the Great Commission, Jesus, is not going to change. So when you're put in situations like the people of the Church of Ephesus, when life just becomes either hard or irritating or, whatever level of severity, is your first impulse going to be, we need to win these people to the Lord because this is why we're here. This is why we're here on earth. This is what God wants us to do. This is the mandate Jesus, gave us before he left, before he ascended. Or is it, we're going to get revenge. We're going to show you. It's just something we're all going to have to think about. And if we go back to Ephesus, they are in a difficult situation. Again, they are trying to, we've got the civil authorities, the Roman world. Again, Christians get targeted time and again. Some of the persecution gets really bad in pockets, historical pockets. But Christianity, again, newsflash, Christianity is not legalized in the Roman Empire until the late 300s AD. That's over 200 years later. Okay, this is not an officially politically recognized belief system or sect. They are viewed with suspicion for any number of reasons. And we probably all, heard, background information, about the situation, with the early church, how the Romans thought the early Christians were atheists because they wouldn't, offer sacrifices to the gods. It was a goofy thought, but you could see how they would get there. That you had Christians that either resisted going into the military in the early church, or if they were there, they had divided loyalties because of their allegiance to Jesus as opposed to, their commanders in certain situations. So that put them in a bad, reputation. There were just any number of reasons why, if you were an early believer, and this is post Nero, Okay. Nero's, again, in the 60s. So regardless of your view of the authorship of Revelation, you're in a post-Nero context. Why bring that up? Because Nero villainized the Christians. All over the Roman world, there's nobody that's embracing these people. So they're in a tough spot. And yet, the letter, here addressed to the Ephesians doesn't say that they're fainting and failing or succumbing to unbelief. They're not. None of the above. But apparently, again, if we loop this passage back to the one in Matthew that Beale brings up, apparently they've let the mission slide. Their love for the people they are left to win is disappearing. It's waning. They're losing enthusiasm for doing ministry among these people. And again, before we beat them up too harshly, it was a serious thing to reveal to someone that you were a Christian and to talk about Jesus, and to, you don't, do I want to let them know that there's a church here in town? This is very much, there's an underground flavor to a lot of these situations. There could be any number of reasons why the early church is just, again, losing enthusiasm for what they're supposed to be doing. And this is what the Lord is concerned with, because this is why you're here. Now, we could go to passage in the Gospels where, any passage in the Gospels that talks about, hey, don't be amazed if people hate you. Jesus says, they hated me. You're not going to be better off. I mean, this whole sense of co-suffering. I mean, Peter's letters are full of this. This is the context for the early church. And again, to me, it makes sense that in view of what they're not failing at, that this particular thing makes sense, again, to sort of target or zero in on, as far as the Lord having a problem with what's going on, in the church of Ephesus. Again, to me, it makes good sense of all the options. Now, before hitting the Nicolaitans, that's verse 6, I want to jump to verse 7. So in Revelation 2:5, you have the removal of the lampstand. Again, that's sort of like a negative motivation to remember you're supposed to be the New Testament version of a kingdom of priests here. Again, tying it back to Israel, because we're tying it back to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Again, and Revelation uses this language of the churches. You're supposed to be a kingdom of priests and so on and so forth. And we've seen that language in other episodes. So the negative motivation is, I'm going to remove your lampstand. I'm just going to call your angel back. You're going to be on your own. As positive motivation, though, for returning to one's first love, John is instructed to write in verse 7, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Now, it's really obvious in this verse, the Old Testament antecedents are very transparent. This is about the future destiny of the believer, the new earth, modeled after the pre-fall Eden. Since the Great Commission is linked by Paul in Romans 9 to the Gentiles being brought in, the people that the Ephesian Christians are supposed to be witnessing to, and that in turn is linked to the Lord's return, the awakening of Israel and the healing of the nations, and the new Eden. The warning here given to the Ephesians actually matters. In other words, if you don't be about the Lord's business, you are contributing to the forestalling of all that's yet to come. And all that's yet to come is just lots of good stuff. Okay, the Lord's going to get his way. We're going to have a new earth, a new Eden. The Lord will return. I mean, if you don't do the job, then that contributes to this getting stretched out. And so we have a negative and a positive, impetus, to get with the program again and remember the program. Now to verse 6 and the whole issue with the Nicolaitans. Now, I have to be honest, I wouldn't really spend any time on this except for the fact that it has a peripheral, or at least a theoretical, Old Testament connection. Let me just read the verse before we jump into this. Verse 6 says, yet this you have, as a commendation, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate, the Lord says. So who are these people? Now, Owen in his Revelation commentary writes this. He says the Nicolaitans are mentioned explicitly only in Revelation 2:6, in the proclamation to Ephesus, And in 2:15, which is the proclamation to the church at Pergamum, in 2:6, it is simply said that the Ephesian Christians hate the works, i.e. the behavior of the Nicolaitans. In Revelation 2:14 and 15, the, quote, teaching of Balaam, unquote, is apparently identical with the teaching of the Nicolaitans and consists of eating meat previously sacrificed to pagan deities and the practice of fornication. So let me read Revelation 2:14 and 15. It says, "But I have a few things against you." This is to the church in Pergamum. "I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans." So either those two things are different, or, On suggests, his opinion is that it's two ways of pointing to the same problem. Okay, he wants to merge these things. So On goes on to wonder if Revelation 2:20 and 21, which refers to that woman Jezebel, another Old Testament allusion, might also be linked to the Nicolaitans, because both that description, the woman Jezebel, and then back here with the Nicolaitans in verses 14 and 15, are described in relation to eating meat sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. These are common threads between both these passages. There is also speculation, and On believes it's really not coherent, that the Nicolaitans are to be linked to the Jews and the so-called Synagogue of Satan, also in Revelation 2. That would be verse 13. I would agree with him. I think that's utterly incoherent. Since the Synagogue of Satan idea doesn't have an Old Testament context in view, or that phrase isn't used in the Old Testament, I'm not going to land on it specifically in a future episode, but this isn't a verse-by-verse series. You have to remember that. But for our purposes here, though, the Jews can be safely ruled out with respect to the Nicolaitan problem in Revelation 2:6 or 20 through 21. Why? Well, the reasons are pretty straightforward. The crimes, the concerns are idolatry and eating meat sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. Okay, when you're talking especially about idolatry and meat sacrificed to idols, these are not Jews. Okay, that ought to be really obvious. We're not talking about Jews here. So this Synagogue of Satan idea is not the Nicolaitan problem. So let's go back to the Nicolaitan stuff. The sin of Balaam is clear enough. Okay, Revelation 2:14 and 15. Israel was led to worship idols and commit sexual immorality as a result of his influence and counsel. We can read about that in Numbers 22, verse 5, all the way through Numbers 25, verse 3, a whole section of the book of Numbers there. It also gets picked up in Numbers 31:8 and 31:16. And Beale writes of this whole Nicolaitan thing, this issue, this problem of identification. He writes this: Balaam was a pagan prophet hired by Balak, king of Moab, to pronounce a curse upon the invading Israelites. God prevented Balaam from doing so and caused him to issue a blessing on them instead. It's Numbers 22:5 through 24:25. However, Balaam subsequently devised a plan in continued disobedience to God, whereby some of the Moabite women would entice the Israelite men to, quote, defect from the Lord, unquote. That's Numbers 31:16. By fornicating with them and joining with them in the worship of their pagan gods. That's Numbers 25, first few verses. This plan was successful, and God punished the Israelites for their idolatrous involvement. And Beale continues, Balaam became proverbial for the false teacher who, for money, influences believers to enter into relationships of compromising unfaithfulness, and who is warned by God to stop, and who is finally punished for continuing to disobey. And biblically, we see that in Numbers 22:7, Deuteronomy 23:4, Nehemiah 13:2, 2 Peter 2:14 through 16, and Jude 5 through 12. But Philo talks about this in some of his books, and Beale, gives you the citations there. So this is what Balaam's known for. He became proverbial for the false teacher who, for money, influences believers to do all this stuff. Beale continues, the episode from Numbers is applied to a group of false teachers in the church of Pergamum because a principle of theological continuity was discerned between the two situations. Now, let me read that again. The episode from Numbers, all the Balaam stuff, is applied to a group of false teachers in the church of Pergamum because a principle of theological continuity was discerned between the two situations. The false teachers were arguing that believers could have closer relationships with pagan culture, institutions, and religion than John thought proper. This is the significance of the expression, quote, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to fornicate, unquote, which applies here not only to the Numbers account, but also to the problem in Pergamum, as is evident from the application of the identical phrase to the situation later on in Thyatira, Revelation 2:20. Although some contend that idolothuton can refer to meat which has been dedicated to an idol and then sold in the marketplace, look at what Paul says about that in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 10, 23 through 30. Even though some contend that that's how we should take what's going on here. It's meat which was dedicated to an idol and then sold in the marketplace. The focus here, Beale says, is not that. It's on eating such food in the context of idolatrous worship, which was also a problem in Corinth. We learned that from 1 Corinthians 10, the first 22 verses. This is clear, Beale says, from the parallels drawn with Balaam and later with Jezebel in Revelation 2:20, both of which concern blatant idolatry. Now, as a sidebar here, Beale, in a footnote, draws attention to something that Ben Witherington III has written. And he notes this. B. Witherington has now shown that all uses of idolothuton in the New Testament, including 1 Corinthians, refer to, quote, meat sacrificed to and eaten in the presence of an idol or in the temple precincts, unquote. And that citation is from an article by Witherington entitled Not So Idle, I-D-L-E, Thoughts. Not So Idle Thoughts. That Ben loves puns. Okay, those of you who caught, our interview with him, way back here on the podcast know that. So he does it again here in an article titled Not So Idle Thoughts. And basically, the point is that, look, we don't have a contradiction here between what John is saying in Revelation 2 and what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. Because in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, look, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols because you're going to enter into fellowship with demons. Okay, that's 1 Corinthians 10, 21, 22. So back in chapter 8, 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says, hey, look, we're believers. We know that an idol is nothing. For us, there's only one God, and so on and so forth. And then you get to verse 10, and he's freaked out, like, don't do this. You're going to be in a fellowship with demons, okay? And what he's talking about is eating the meat in participation with a ritual or on unholy ground, so to speak. And in 1 Corinthians 10, a few verses after he warns them about fellowshipping with demons, he says, look, if the meat, if you find it at the marketplace, okay, yeah, it was sacrificed to an idol, but now, you find it at the marketplace, that's not so much of a problem. That's okay. It's permissible. Actually, he said, in 1 Corinthians 10, he's talking about issues of conscience, okay? 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. So there's a difference there. And what Beale is saying, and what Witherington is saying is, look, what John is concerned with is not a contradiction of Paul's allowance to eat the meat that had been sold in the marketplace. That's not the case. The people who take that trajectory are wrong. And Beale is citing Witherington's work saying everywhere that this term is used, you can connect it to the non-sacred, the sacred space of a foreign god, again, pagan turf, so to speak, or again, some ritualistic involvement. That is the sin of Balaam. Okay, that's participation in and with idolatry. So that's what John's after. That's what Paul was after. And Paul's allowance in 1 Corinthians 10 about eating meat that was sold in the marketplace, it's not the same thing. So to mop up, does this really help us identify the Nicolaitans? What's in a name? Now, On notes that the Nicolaitans do get discussed by a number of church fathers. Most of them, if not all of those references, seem to be based on Revelation 2:6, Revelation 2:14 and 15, the verses we're talking about. But it gets combined with a specific name, Nicolaus, who was one of the 7 deacons, according to Acts 6:5, and a heavy, so the church fathers are looking at this name. They're looking at, the Revelation 2 Nicolaitans, and basically says what the church fathers are doing is taking the references in Revelation, taking this name in Acts 6, and then basically I'll use his wording, using a heavy admixture of legend and imagination. Basically, he says they just make up stuff to come up with an identity for the Nicolaitans that has no basis in either the New Testament or any other early writing as far as the identification of the Nicolaitans. It has not. You can't trace them back to this deacon in Acts 6. Okay, is his point. And who are the church fathers who do this? He owned, references Irenaeus and Hippolytus and Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian. Some famous church fathers, but he's like, they're just making it up. There's no basis to this. Now, On makes that observation, and Beale follows him as well. Beale is of the same mind. They think that the name has nothing to do with Nicolaus in Acts, but it's symbolic. And this explanation, I think, seems to have something to it. This isn't a specific actual group, but the name itself is symbolic. It's using etymology to create an association of the idolatry problem with Balaam. So again, another way of saying that is the terms, the names, both of Balaam and the problem of idolatry. You can break that name up etymologically, and then that was used to sort of, create the linkage to what's going on in Ephesus that John is writing about. Let me just quote Beale's explanation. It's a lot more succinct and coherent. Some suggest, Beale writes, that Nicolaitans could be merely another name for the Balaam sect, since their teaching is emphatically equated with that of the other group. In the same manner, you have also some holding the teaching of the Nicolaitans in the same way, later on at Pergamum. The two teachings are identified further by the similarity of the etymology of their names. So here we go. Nikolaon means he overcomes the people. And in rabbinic literature, Balaam or Bil'am was etymologized to Balaam or Balaam, which means he who consumes the people. That's rabbinic. That's from rabbinic writings. Or it could be construed as Ba'al-am, he who rules over the people. So you have part of the Nicolaitan name and the Balaam name, depending on how you divide the syllables and the etymology you use. They can mean kind of the same thing. Okay, this devouring of the people, overcoming of the people. The actual participation in idolatrous situations, Beale feels, sort of reflects that idea, that when the people are participating in idolatry, it overcomes them. The church at Pergamum get, pardon the pun, swallowed up, okay, they get consumed by their idolatry. That's not so much true, obviously, of the church at Ephesus, which is our focus for this episode, because they're not going down this rabbit trail. They oppose the Nicolaitans. Okay, but there's a greater concern later on at Pergamum, for the effect that this idolatry and the immorality is having on the church. And we'll get to that in the next episode as well, a little bit more. So Beale and On and other scholars are saying the name is probably chosen in Greek, going back to the quote, Nikolaon, he who overcomes the people, who conquers the people. So whoever's teaching them to do this is starting, to conquer believers. And since the term Balaam could be etymologized the same way, that's why John creates the connection. He wants his readers to understand that what's happening here in Ephesus and Pergamum and these churches, this is akin to what went on in the days of Balaam. So it's not that you actually have a sect that takes a name Nicolaitans, they hang a shingle outside, the Nicolaitan, First Church of the Nicolaitans here. It's not an actual sect or people group. Rather, it's a label to put on those who are seducing believers into idolatry and immorality. And the connection with Balaam is done through the word meanings, the etymology. I think, again, that's better. I mean, I don't know that that's certain, but it's better than saying, oh, it's probably some followers of this guy Nicolaus in Acts chapters. Well, again, it'd be different if you had a textual record of that. But the church fathers don't have specific references textually to that. They just sort of glom onto the idea. As again, going back to On's quote, it's an admixture of legend and imagination. I don't really have anything to hang the hat on, but it sounded good. It was a way of explaining it. Whereas, again, if they had gotten into the Hebrew etymology, which is asking a lot for early church fathers who didn't know Hebrew, if you're going to do that, then you can kind of see how the two things would fit together. So, again, that's an Old Testament relationship. Is it really repurposing the Old Testament? Well, a little bit, kind of, sort of. I mean, if this is what's going on, John seems to be aware of it and wants his audience, again, to think about the situation they're in. And he's going to ask the church at Pergamum to do the same thing. Consider what's happening here. This ought to take your mind right back to Balaam and what a disaster that was. Both in terms of what was happening, boots on the ground, and God's response to it. You do not want to go down this road. So, again, we'll just wrap up chapter 2, or at least the first 7 verses with that. And again, next time we're going to try to finish chapter 2. We've already, dipped into what, the second half of it with some of the Balaam stuff. But we'll revisit that a little bit and pick up some of the other material. But that's where I'd like to stop for today. I think it's a good place to stop and sort of sets up what we'll do next time.
Well, we're wrapping up Revelation 2 today, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. Yep, we are. We're going to get all the way through because, again, this isn't, verse by verse or anything like that. We go through the chapter, and if it has some link back into the Old Testament, John referencing something in the Old Testament, doing something with an Old Testament passage, that's our focus. We are not going through Revelation to talk about Black Hawk helicopters and microchips and nanotechnology and all that kind of stuff. If you want that, you can read my novels, okay? Because, we like to do stuff like that in there. But for this podcast, it's biblical theology. We look at the text. And so Revelation repurposes the Old Testament a lot. And if you've been following the series up to this point, you know that it gets messy too, because John just sort of assumes that you have a solid grasp of the Old Testament. You're sort of going to know where he's getting stuff, and then you'll be able to ask the question, why are you doing that, John? And again, if you have a real good grasp of your Old Testament, you'll sort of be able to figure that out. So that's what we're doing as we're tracking through Revelation. And last time we took the first 7 verses, the letter to the Ephesian church. And in this case, we're going to pick up a few more churches in verses 8 through 29, which is toward the end of the chapter. But we're going to have to do a little review from the last episode because in this chapter, we hit, for instance, the Nicolaitans, which we need to say something about in this episode, but we already commented on it in the last episode. And we actually ended last time with a reference to the Nicolaitans. Again, that was verse 6 at the time, but we're going to run into the Nicolaitans again in Revelation 2, 14 and 15. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if you recall, last time I quoted from Aun's commentary on Revelation, his Word Biblical Commentary. And by the way, his name is spelled A-U-N-E. And he wrote, the Nicolaitans are mentioned explicitly only in Revelation 2:6, in the proclamation to Ephesus, and 2:15 in the proclamation to Pergamum. In 2:6, it is simply said the Ephesian Christians hate the works, i.e. the behavior of the Nicolaitans. And in verses 14 and 15, the, quote, teaching of Balaam, unquote, is apparently identical with the, quote, teaching of the Nicolaitans, unquote. And that behavior, that teaching, consists of eating meat previously sacrificed to pagan deities and the practice of fornication. On goes on in his commentary to wonder if Revelation 2, 20 and 21, with its reference to, quote, that woman Jezebel, unquote, might be linked to the Nicolaitans because both are described in relation to eating meat sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. And the answer to that is going to be, yeah, because what this is really angling for is these aberrant practices. There's a reason why John is referencing two prominent examples of idolatry and immorality that he wants to warn the church about. There's a reason he picks two prominent examples of just that, Balaam, Jezebel, okay, because he wants to create this very negative association. And the sin of Balaam is clear enough. We noted this last time. Israel was led to worship idols and commit sexual immorality as a result of his influence and counsel. It's Numbers 22 through 25, those 3 chapters. And this is one, again, of 2 necessary points. Again, these connections to Balaam specifically, and then Jezebel is looped in. You have to sort of understand what the reference are to understand the consensus of scholars about the Nicolaitans, that they weren't actually a literal sect. Rather, the term is pejorative. Nicolaitan is a pejorative term designed by etymology, you may recall this from last time, to link idolatry and immorality in general with Balaam of the Old Testament. You say, well, how does that work? Well, both terms, if you divide up Nicolaitan, you get Nikalaon, which means he or it overcomes the people. And in rabbinic literature, the rabbis, took the name Balaam, and you could divide that into syllables too. Again, doing etymology, Bilam or Balaam or Balaam. Those derivatives mean, again, this essentially the same thing, he or it who consumes the people. You could also go Baal-am, he lords over people, or he or it rules over the people. So there are certain etymologies that sound suspiciously like Nikalaon, he or it overcomes the people. And so therefore, these terms, when they're broken down into constituent parts, mean essentially the same thing, and it's for that reason. And, we should add, the specific absence of a historical sect that corresponds to John's era. It's for those 2 reasons that scholars think the term Nicolaitans is just a functional pejorative. So we covered that last time. We're not going to stop at verses 14 and 15 here to go over it again. So if you're listening here for the first time, you didn't listen to the previous episode, you'll wonder, well, why are you skipping the Balaam stuff? Well, it's because we've already covered it, and now we've reviewed it. So on to the rest of chapter 2. And there isn't a whole lot of specific is the operative word, use of the Old Testament here. There are some rabbit trails, though, that we need to take. And, there'll be some stopping points, some signposts along the way through the rest of chapter 2. Let's go to verse 9, where there's a reference to the Synagogue of Satan, the Synagogue of Satan. Let me just read the reference, get a little context here for you all. So Revelation 2:9, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Okay, so there's this reference to this thing. John continues in verse 10, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Okay, so that's essentially the guts of the letter to the church at Smyrna. That's Revelation 2:8 through 11. And we get this reference to the Synagogue of Satan in verse 9. We're going to see the same, or similar reference later in 3:9. So the question is, what is that? Now, some, say just because we have the word synagogue here, synagogue, that has led some to say that the phrase Synagogue of Satan is inherently, again, that's a key word, inherently anti-Semitic. And that, I'm here to say, is nonsense. Okay, yes, John is angry at a very specific Jewish opposition, which leads to followers of Jesus being persecuted. Well, duh. Like, who wouldn't be angry? If you, let's say you're a bunch of Italians or Germans or Swedes or whatever, and you're betraying essentially your countrymen, of course you're going to be angry. You just shouldn't do that. But again, a Jew, and please recall, John is a Jew. Okay, the writer is a Jew. But a Jew being angry at a fellow Jew for persecuting fellow Jews for embracing Jesus as Messiah isn't anti-Semitism, this whole cloth kind of thing. So I would say if you think that, you need to check your definition of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is focused on ethnicity. Okay, you're just that class of person, You're a Jew. Okay, you're a Jew, therefore I hate you because you're a Jew. Again, the writer's a Jew. I mean, saying that John is anti-Semitic is like being angry at a criminal who has harmed you and then being accused of being anti-human. Well, the criminals are humans, so you don't like that criminal, so you must be anti-human. It's just ridiculous. Okay, my point is that people can be angry at people for wicked things they do and not have that mean they are angry at all people in that particular villain's subculture. So John thinks they're liars and false Jews because Jews, at least according to the Torah, remember the Torah? Okay. According to the Torah, Jews were supposed to treat their brethren, their fellow Jews, with justice. Anyone who thinks clearly ought to see that out of the gate. I mean, just if you know the Torah, this is Torah. This is the law. This is how you treat your fellow countrymen. And obviously, these Jews in this context were not doing that. Now you could say, well, okay, these Christian Jews, they're violating the Torah. They're holding beliefs that aren't correct about the Messiah. Well, sure, but why don't you just expunge them from synagogues? Like we're not welcome here anymore. Why do you have to turn them over to the Romans for execution or torture or whatever? Okay, it's violating the Torah. Okay, these are not principles of justice. It's not just designed to protect the community. It's designed to punish and kill. Okay, so that they are violating the Torah and persecuting brethren means that these offenders, are aligned with evil. And of course, John would add that they are aligned with evil because they also reject the Messiah. I mean, John obviously believes Jesus is the Messiah, so we have a problem there. But again, this is a doctrinal disagreement. And we're not dealing with a theocracy here because the Jews aren't in charge of anything. What they're doing is they're turning their fellow brethren that they have this theological disagreement over to persecution and death. And yeah, that's something to be angry at if you're John. But that doesn't mean you think all Jews are like this. You don't put these offenders, you don't let the offenders color the whole category because he is one of them. Okay, and their mission is to win them over to believing in Jesus as the Messiah. They can't just turn their back and go away because that would be disobeying their Messiah. I mean, this is part of why Jesus came. So, this is an overblown but very easy to make accusation when it comes to the Synagogue of Satan language. It has a context. The context is very specific. It's very understandable. So let's just sort of have a grasp on the obvious here when we look at this phrase. Now, you also have throne of Satan that's going to show up, and we need to understand Synagogue of Satan. They're of the Synagogue of Satan with the throne of Satan, and the throne of Satan is not Jewish. It's not a synagogue. It is a place specifically in Pergamum or Pergamum. Okay, you see it pronounced either way and spelled either way. In verse 13. So we're going to find out that the clearest reference to that is the pagan authority. So that alone should tell you that we are not dealing with anti-Semitism. We are dealing with a subsect of the Jewish community in league with pagan ruling authorities to persecute and kill their own brethren. That's the context. So let's check our anti-Semitism definition and have it make more sense. And if you look at the context, it's very evident that this is what John is angling for. Verses 10 and 11, I'll read them again. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. He tells, the members of the church at Smyrna who are being, persecuted by the, quote, synagogue of Satan. Don't fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Later in chapter 3, when we get the synagogue of Satan reference again, and, again, we're going to loop throne of Satan in here in a moment. We read this in chapter 3. This is verses 9 through 11. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world, to try those who dwell on the earth. I am coming soon. In other words, what does John suggest should be the response of those persecuted toward their Jewish brethren? Does he say, get revenge, retaliate? No, he says, deal with the suffering. Do not fear that you're about to suffer. To use an Old Testament phrase, John opts for vengeance belongs to God. Let God handle it. Okay, he does not recommend retaliation. Vengeance is the Lord's. That's not for you to decide. So again, John's the writer here. It would be kind of weird if he was really anti-Semitic for him to recommend a suffering response. So like I said, let's check our definitions here so that they make sense before we start blathering on about it. Continuing, Satan's throne comes up in 2:13. Let me just read that verse. This is to the church at Pergamum. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. You hold fast my name, and you do not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. So there we have a very obvious reference to persecution again, but we have this Satan's throne. Now, there's no specific Old Testament touch point for this. Indirectly, though, in Revelation, Satan is connected to the dragon. There's the dragon figure in several passages. Revelation 12 is one of those, but there's at least one other. And the dragon, of course, is a clear chaos image. Now, this imagery prompts Owen to write this. This is again from his commentary. The fact that throne, is articular, it has the definite article, suggests that the author is alluding to a specific throne, either literally or figuratively, which he expects the readers to recognize. The throne of Satan, i.e., the throne of the dragon, is mentioned again in Revelation 13, verse 2, where the dragon, previously identified by such aliases as the devil and Satan in 12:9, the dragon gives it to the beast from the sea, which clearly suggests the association of the throne with the imperial cult. The throne of the beast is again mentioned in 16:10, when the fifth bowl angel plunges his kingdom in darkness by pouring out the bowl of plagues on his throne. In neither 13:2 nor 16:10, however, is the throne localized, while in Revelation 2:13 it is placed in Pergamum. So basically, again, to decipher all that, On is arguing that, again, that this throne of Satan, or throne of the dragon, is connected with the beast of the sea. Again, a very obvious chaos imagery here. He's going to say, look, this is going to be associated with the kingdom, a kingdom, an authority, a power that represents chaos. And what's the term that John is going to use in Revelation for this kingdom? Babylon. Okay? So and who's the power of the day? Well, it's Rome. It's very obvious. So you're dealing with a reference, this throne of Satan, in this case in Pergamum, and then others it's not as specific. You're dealing with imperial authority. And here we go again. You have certain Jews that are turning their comrades, their brethren, even that they have this theological disagreement with. They're turning them over to the secular authorities for torture and death. Okay, this is the problem. So what about the throne of Satan, though? I'll throw this in, even though there's no clear Old Testament referent other than chaos imagery, which goes back to Babylon, which again is a term that John's going to use in the book. So it should be, put those data points together, connect those dots. It should be sort of obvious as, that this is an imperial power that is opposed to the kingdom of God. But Owen lists several options for interpreting the throne in the history of scholarship. And I thought I'd throw this in because some of you out there might find this interesting as to where, is there a place in Pergamum that we would associate with this? Like if we could go back in time and we were in Pergamum and we walk up to somebody on the street and say, hey, where's the where's the throne of the dragon? Or probably better, because that sounds pejorative to a pagan, living in Pergamum. Hey, where's the seat of authority? Where would I go? Like where all the power is held? What spot in the city would that be? So that's what Owen is trying to get at here. What you could use certain phrases, and if you were talking to a citizen, it's this place or that place. There are certain candidates, okay, as to how this question could be answered. And here's his list. I'm not going to go through all his notes here, but this comes from his commentary. Number 1, the Temple of Augustus is a candidate, perhaps originally built at the foot of the Acropolis of Pergamum by permission of Augustus in 29 BC. So this is going to be around when John, is writing. The specific site, though, for us, for moderns, though, has never been located. It no longer exists. And Owen comments, this view coheres well with the view expressed in the Testament of Job. Again, this is a Second Temple Jewish text. Testament of Job 3:5 and 4:4, where a pagan temple is called Ha-Topos to Satana, the place of Satan. So that's a candidate. Temple of Augustus, place of Satan, according to the Testament of Job. Okay, let's put that on the list. That might be it. Number 2, the great altar of Zeus Soter. That's Zeus the Savior. Okay. This elaborate column structure was constructed during the reign of Eumenes II, 197 to 59 BC, to commemorate a Pergamene victory of the Gauls in 190 BC. It was decorated with elaborate bas-reliefs depicting the gigantomachy, that is the battle between the Olympian gods and the giants. And, like the Temple of Augustus in Roma, was located on the Acropolis. Reportedly, this Acropolis could be seen from all sides at a great distance. Further, the equation of the altar and the throne is an ancient one. Now, I've actually put a link here on the episode page so you can go look at a reconstruction of the great altar of Zeus Soter with the gigantomachy, the battle between the Olympian gods and giants, the sculptures that how it would have looked, because there are pieces of this that remain. And there are actually several projects. And when I was in, when I was in Vienna for an International Society of Biblical Literature meeting, boy, this was years ago, they had part of this on loan, I think, from the museum at Berlin, which is where you could go see it. And it's pretty spectacular, the recreation, but it's obviously associated with the wars between the gods and the giants. And so this becomes a candidate for Satan's throne. Again, nobody's sure, but it's kind of an interesting possibility. Third, the judge's bench or tribunal, where the proconsul sat to judge, could be referred to here as the throne of Satan. The Roman proconsul, again, it's imperial authority. This is where the imperial, figure who's going to decide cases where he sits. The Roman proconsul resided at Pergamum, and it was to Pergamum that Christians in the surrounding area were brought after being denounced by informers, even at a later date. Fourth, the temple of Asclepios. Asclepios was linked in special ways with the symbol of the serpent, which Christians associated with Satan. Okay, Revelation 12, 2 Corinthians 11. So this becomes a possibility too. Number 5, Pergamum as a center of persecution. In other words, really the city itself. The throne of Satan, the dominion of Satan, again, just as Pergamum generally, which caused the oppression of Christians. Okay, so that there's a possibility there. And, on cites verse 13 here about Antipas being slain, again, a martyr, so on and so forth, where Satan dwells. So maybe it's just a reference to the city or the town. It's certainly not a Jewish group. It's the locus of authority. Number 6, he offers Pergamum as a major center of the imperial cult. Maybe, again, it's the city for that reason. Maybe number 7, Pergamum is to be thought of as the seat of, or the throne of Satan, because it was a center for Greco-Roman pagan religion generally. The city was filled with idols. Maybe that's why. And lastly, he suggests the shape. It might refer to the shape of a hill on which the city was built, having some sort of serpentine feature. But honestly, who knows? There are some good candidates there. I kind of favor the great altar of Zeus. But again, I'm not basing that on anything other than just the nature of the altar and the fact that, Zeus claimed to be the Most High. We've talked about this in the first or second episode of this series, how Zeus was referred to as Hoopsistos, the Most High. And that's, what the episode we talked about the name. If that's the case, it could have been associated by Christians with the desire for another deity to be called Most High, which would take their minds back to Isaiah 14, and so on and so forth. rebellion in the council. And again, I like the great altar of Zeus because it's about rebellion in the council and these wars. And, who knows? The honest answer is who knows, but I kind of prefer that one just because it has more than just one sort of connection to it. Now, all of that is sort of backdrop and kind of incidental or indirect references. Let's get to some specific Old Testament references. If we keep going in chapter 2, and we're still in the letter to Pergamum, we get verse 17. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. Now, there are 3 metaphors essentially here for eternal life in Revelation 2:17, and they all have Old Testament antecedents. So let's just break verse 17 down. The first one, the hidden manna. Of course, manna was the food of angels. There's a reference to that effect in Psalm 78:25, and the Septuagint at 77:25. Why is it called the food of angels? Well, because it's food from heaven, and heaven is where the angels are. The food, that they eat. This must be what angels eat because the food's dropping from heaven. It's Exodus 16, the story of the manna. You can also find references to manna because it's food from heaven. That this is the food that will be served at the ultimate meal with God, the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is the gathering. That the event, the gathering toward which all the previous biblical meals with God move, or that they are related to. There are lots of meals with God, in the Old Testament. Genesis 18 is sort of an obvious one, but you've got, Exodus 24, Moses and Nadav and Abihu and Aaron, they go up set with the elders, they see the God of Israel, and they have a meal. Okay, there are a number of these kinds of events that foreshadow the ultimate meal with the Lord, which is the marriage supper of the Lamb, the day of the Lord meal, when everything is consummated, and as I've mentioned before, where Leviathan is served, for dinner. Leviathan is consumed, chaos is consumed, it is no more. So there's a lot of imagery here. John 6, 31 through 35. Let's just read that because I think there's a tie-in here with manna, obviously. This is the bread of life passage. Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven. That would be me, Jesus, and gives life to the world. They said to him, Sir, give us this bread always. And then Jesus in verse 35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. And then so on and so forth. So the bread of life passage, again, food from heaven, this whole idea, and of course associated with Jesus. And that association in turn makes us think of the marriage supper of the Lamb. All these ideas are related. They're all connected. And so this reference to hidden manna, he who has an ear, Revelation 2:17, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, the one who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna. In other words, you're going to be at the table. You're going to be at the table. Now, Beale writes this of this passage in his massive New International Greek Text Commentary on Revelation. He writes, the promise of hidden manna is a metaphorical portrayal of end-time fellowship and identification with Christ, which will be consummated at the marriage supper of the Lamb, in which those refusing to participate in pagan feasts, remember the idolatry problem? Those refusing to participate in pagan feasts, they will be rewarded with that fellowship, with that supper. Beale continues, manna was also a portrayal of eschatological expectation in Jewish writings. Then he cites a bunch of rabbinic texts. This was a promise sometimes addressed to those not worshiping idols. Again, if you refuse what's going on with idolatry, and you'll get hidden manna. Again, it was a familiar thought. Again, in the Second Temple period, we're not going to eat the food served to idols. We're not going to participate in these rituals because we want to have a seat at the table of the Lord, the Messiah at the last day. Some have proposed, Beale continues, that the hiddenness is linked to the Jewish tradition that Jeremiah hid the manna in the ark before the temple was destroyed, and that it would be revealed again when the Messiah came. Okay, that's 2 Maccabees 2, 4 through 7. We've done an episode a long time ago, it seems now, on the Ark of the Covenant, what happened. We get into this some of these Jeremiah, legends and whatnot. I did an episode of this on the Fringe Pop too. But again, Beale comments that, there were some that thought, well, Jeremiah hid it. It's going to come out, when the Messiah, returns, so on and so forth. Beale adds another thought. This is not incompatible, this whole set of ideas. It's not incompatible with the understanding of the hiddenness described above. So, maybe the ark, the presence of God, it sort of goes, these ideas sort of go together. The manna given to Israel in the wilderness, he says, was also said to have been hidden in the high heavens from the beginning of creation. You ask, well, where is that? That's actually the Targum. One of the, Targum is an Aramaic translation. So an Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, specifically Exodus 16, 4 through 15. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan actually says this about the manna. Manna given to Israel in the wilderness was also said to have been hidden in the high heavens from the beginning of creation, and was ultimately to prosper Israel at the end of days. It's Targum Neophiti for Exodus 8:16. Now, again, these are late texts. I thought I'd throw that in there because they're kind of interesting. It tells you that there's certain ideas in the Jewish community about manna, but these texts are much later than John's era. But nevertheless, they're interesting. Next part of the verse, 2:17b. What is up with the white stone? Let me just read it again, the verse again. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. Like, what's up with the white stone? The Greek here is psephon leukein. And Owen writes this, psephos, that's P-S-E, long E, P-H-O-S, psephos, means pebble, stone, and therefore gem. And he cites some classical texts. It can even be used in the more specific sense of a magical gem or a magical amulet. Most frequently, however, since psephoi were used for voting, casting votes, psephos came to mean vote. The adjective leukoi, white, is used of favorable votes. Beale has some of these same thoughts, but again, he adds a little bit of information here. He says, there may be no single background for the white stone. It could be intentionally elusive and suggest diverse but compatible historical associations. The presence of multiple backgrounds is a phenomenon we have already encountered and will meet again throughout the book. That's an understatement. I mean, John draws stuff from everywhere. Back to Beale. He says, a white stone was commonly associated with a vote of acquittal. He cites 4 Maccabees 15:26, Acts 26:10 for casting the votes. Or it was associated with a favorable vote. Conversely, a black stone indicated guilt. So this is the way, let me just stop here. So if you had a council or a communal, community or Sanhedrin or whatever, they're casting votes, you'd get white or black stones. White stones, you're not guilty, you're acquitted. Black stone, you're guilty. So this is a cultural thing. Back to Beale. The white stone also enforces the idea of the manna as a heavenly reward, since the Old Testament describes the heavenly manna as resembling, get this, white bdellium stones. That's Exodus 16:31. And Numbers 11:7. The Septuagint of Numbers 11:7 compares it to, quote, the appearance of rock crystal, okay, unquote. The association of white, Beale continues, with righteousness in direct connection with admission to a banquet is expressed in 19:8 and 9, where the fine linen, bright and clean. Okay, this is Revelation 19. Where the fine linen, bright and clean. These are the people invited to the marriage supper. Represents the righteous acts of the saints, which is directly followed by the reference to being invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Elsewhere, always in the book, white is metaphorical for righteousness. 13 times, Beale says. Whiteness probably also connotes the victory won by the person who conquers through persevering faith and righteousness. Revelation 6:2, Revelation 19:14. So to the one who overcomes, I will give him the hidden manna and a white stone. Again, it's a vote of approval. You belong here. You're clean. You're righteous. Why? Because you're believing loyalty to the Messiah, to Jesus. So again, it has this Old Testament precedent and this wider, Second Temple Jewish, precedent of voting and acquittal and these sorts of things like this. So this is where, again, John is drawing from this. But for me personally, I think it is really interesting. The Exodus 16:31, Numbers 11:7 references about comparing manna to the appearance of rock crystal or white bdellium stones. I think is really interesting here. Last component. So you get a white stone, quote, with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. So here's the basic question of this third element. Does the wording that John has here, does it point to a divine name, in other words, the name of God or Jesus, being written on the stone, or does it refer to the name of the conquering Christian to whom the stone is given? Which is it? Now, scholars have speculated that the idea might be drawn from a couple of Old Testament passages. One is Isaiah 62:2, where God is speaking of Zion, and we read this. The nations shall see your righteousness, and all the kings your glory. And you shall be called by a new name, and the mouth of the Lord will give. So there's this new name for Zion. It doesn't really answer the question, though. Is it God's name or is it the Christian's name? Another possible source is Isaiah 65:15. And again, God is speaking about the enemies of his people, and we read this. You shall leave your name to my chosen for a curse, and the Lord God will put you to death. But his servants he will call by another name. And still doesn't really answer the question, but again, there's this hint of identification, this hint of you belong to me. Okay, that sort of thing in that Isaiah 65 reference. Now Owen picks up on this, and he looks at the Targum, one of the Targums for Isaiah 65:15, this last part about being called by another name, and he writes this. In Targum Isaiah 65:15b, this notion of a different name is connected with another concept found in Revelation, that is the second death. So let me go back to the passage here in Revelation 2:17. Okay, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will give him a white stone, with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. And back up just a few verses. Verse 11, it said, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. The second death, of course, is the final judgment, your eternal separation from God. So On says, it interests On that, you've got this being put to death in Isaiah 65:15. The enemies of God are going to be put away, ostensibly forever, but his servants will be called by their name. So On looks at this, and he says, in the Targum of Isaiah 65:15, both of these ideas are connected. We find them both in Revelation, one in verse 11, one in 17. He says that's kind of interesting. We have both of these. And then he quotes Isaiah 65:15b again. He quotes Revelation 2:11, which we just did. He says there's another obvious parallel, though, with Revelation 3:12, where the exalted Christ says that the name of God, the name of the city of God, and, quote, my own new name will be written on the conquering Christians. Okay, so let's just go to that verse, Revelation 3:12. This is something we'd run into next episode, but we'll hit it here. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So Owen's saying, we probably ought to be thinking about this in Revelation 2:17 with what is said in Revelation 3:12. It might answer the question. He also references Revelation 19:12, where the exalted Christ appears under the imagery of a conquering warrior who has, quote, a name inscribed which no one knows but he himself. Now, On relates all of this. He goes through all this, and he goes back to the stone idea and how white stones were used of magical amulets that bore the names and epithets of deities, and how divine names were used in healings and exorcisms in the early church. And so he lands, if you asked him, which is it? Is it the name of God or Jesus, or the name of the Christian on the stone? He lands on the name being the name of God or Jesus for all these reasons. I would say it probably is just simpler, just to go to Revelation 3:12. And this is what Beale does. Beale writes this of the language. The new name written on the stone confirms further the idea of an end-time supper, in which intimate fellowship occurs. Revelation 3:12 reveals that the name in 2:17 is a pregnant reference to the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and that is Christ's new name, which is written on the believer. So Beale says, point blank, Revelation 3:12 is the answer to the question of Revelation 2:17, the third part, 17c. Now, again, that's a fairly clean path, just to appeal to Revelation 3:12. It makes sense. So the answer to the question would be: it's not the Christian's name that's written on the white stone. It's the name. It's the name of God. It's the name of the New Jerusalem. It's the name of Jesus. This is what's written on the stone because it's like your ticket in. Okay, it's your pass. It is. It's the thing that grants you admittance. These are symbolic, and references here too. If you are identified with God and the New Jerusalem, and of course Jesus, you're in. It goes with the end time supper. This is your admission ticket to the meal, okay, to the hidden manna, all this stuff. So to me, I think that makes the best sense rather than the name of the Christian. And here's another reason why I like it. What do we really have here? We have name theology. We're going to see its reverse, by the way, later on when we get to the beast. How do we know those who are aligned with the beast? His name, his number is upon them, okay? This idea of the name indicating ownership, it's name theology. All the way back to, the Old Testament. And we've had Carmen Imes on the show, bearing the name, her book, her popular version of her dissertation, which was also published as a scholarly work, but bearing the name. This is what it is. Revelation 2:17 is about bearing the Lord's name. And that indicates you're in the family. You are his. So to me, there's a very strong attachment to Old Testament thinking here. And to illustrate it, Aaron's blessing, Numbers 6, 22 through 27. And Carmen, again, references this in her book, obviously. But it reads this as follows. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So, this is verse 27, so shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. So this was a priestly gesture to identify the people as the people of God, identify them with the Lord. They are his. They're called out among all the nations. They're the subset. They're the elect. All these ideas intertwine. And to me, what we have here in Revelation 2:17, Revelation 3:12, is a New Testament application of the same idea. And again, we're going to get its reverse later on. To not have the name of Jesus on you, but the name of the beast, it couldn't be any clearer. Again, these are symbolic, metaphorical ideas. It's not like when you die and you get to heaven, somebody walks up to you, an angel walks up to you with a stamp, ka-chunk, there's the four consonants, on your forehead. That isn't the idea. The idea is ownership. The Lord knows those who are his, who are aligned with him. They bear his name. They represent him. They are his imagers. And it's the same thing on the other side. To refuse, to reject the gospel, according to the book of Revelation, is to align yourself to be an imager of the beast, the dragon, Satan, all this stuff, okay, that goes with the other side. So it goes back to the priestly blessing. It goes back to the name. You think of unseen realm here. I spent 3 chapters here, talking about the name theology. The name is another way to refer to God himself. The name of the Lord appears, visually in certain contexts. It's God embodied in human form. All these ideas, again, wind up funneling into Jesus, and here we get them applied to believers. Now, again, if you go to, keep going in chapter 2, to be honest with you, I cover all of this stuff in Unseen Realm. But if we continue on in Revelation 2, here's what we read. Okay, verse 18 through 29 is the letter to the church at Thyatira. Okay, so it starts off in verse 18, to the angel of the church at Thyatira, right? The words of the Son of God, who has his eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. That harkens back to chapter 1, description of the Son of Man, Ancient of Days, merged into one. I know your works, your love and your faith and service and patient endurance. And then he says, I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel. So just as the church of Ephesus was resisting the idolatry and the immorality, here Thyatira, they're giving in. He says, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, again, using her as a symbol of pagan religion that involves sexual immorality. That's verse 20. Eating food sacrificed to idols, verse 20. Why? Because, like Paul discussed in 1 Corinthians 10, we talked about this last week. This was to have fellowship, to sit at whose table? The table of demons, the table of the fallen gods. You're on the other side. You're on the other side when you do this. Okay, I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her sexual immorality. Again, the pagans have been warned here, so on and so forth. Again, there's a reference here to just, again, general people who follow other gods. And so there's a judgment laid out. I'm going to strike her children dead. The churches will know that I am he who searches mind and heart. So that the church is sort of getting caught up in this judgment, in this punishment. To the rest of you in Thyatira who do not hold this teaching, who have not learned what some call the deep things of Satan, to you I say, I do not lay on you any other burden. Only hold fast what you have until I come. So some of you people in Thyatira are holding the line. And I know it and I see it. Just keep up with that. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations. And he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father. And I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And that's how chapter 2 closes. Now, both of those things, verse 26, I will give him, the one who overcomes, authority over the nations. Again, quoting a messianic psalm about believers. Messianic psalm aimed at Jesus, the authority over the nations. But it's actually quoted here of believers. And then the morning star, sharing the morning star. The Messiah. Again, the morning star is a symbol of messianic rulership, but that gets shared with believers, those who overcome. I've discussed both of those at length in Unseen Realm, so I'm not going to repeat that content here. Most of you have read Unseen Realm. If you have not, well, you need to read Unseen Realm, to follow a lot of what we're doing here. But again, I'm not going to just rehearse that content. But what you have here is you have, at the end of days, those who overcome, those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb, those who are united to Christ, their believing loyalty it has held firm. Okay, those are the people who will inherit the rule of the nations. Well, who rules the nations now? Deuteronomy 32 worldview. It's the fallen gods who Paul calls demons in 1 Corinthians 10. It says, don't have fellowship with them by participating in feasts and, of course, immorality with those guys. Okay, you got to pick sides. You got to pick sides. You do not want to be in fellowship with the other side, because ultimately they will be displaced and replaced. And who are they replaced by? Human believers who inherit the rule of the nations. And the nations are brought back into the family of God. Again, this is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview on the New Testament side. For those, again, who have read Unseen Realm, followed this podcast or my content, this is biblical theology 101, and that's a good thing. Okay, that's a good thing, because these are the kinds of things that tie both testaments together. So if this is new to you, again, read Unseen Realm, get up to speed. But these are important, metaphors that show how the Deuteronomy 32 worldview works out. I might as well throw in 1 Corinthians 6:3. If this is new to you, I challenge you. Read 1 Corinthians 6:3. Don't you know that you're going to judge angels or rule over angels, however you want to translate that? The commentators have no idea what to do with that. This audience knows exactly what to do with that. Okay, it goes into this motif of the gods who were put over the nations in judgment at Babel. Deuteronomy 32:8, reading that with the Septuagint and with the Dead Sea Scrolls. When the Most High divided the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. It's Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9. You know exactly what to do with that. The nations were judged at Babel, put under other gods, okay, the Elohim, okay, members of the heavenly host. They were placeholders, but they become corrupt according to Psalm 82. They, rule the nations terribly. They sow chaos among the nations. God sentences them in Psalm 82 at a meeting of him and his council that you're going to die like men. You're going to die like men. I'm going to do away with you. And we other passages, Isaiah 34, Isaiah 27, talks about the judgment of the heavenly host and so on. This is what it is. This is what it is. So this is why Paul, again, when he goes to these nations, he knows exactly what he's dealing with. All the nations other than Israel are under dominion of hostile powers of darkness. They're not mere demons. Demons are low level on the pecking order. These guys are geopolitical entities, okay? This is where Daniel gets his theology. Daniel 10, Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece. Oh, that's cool. Supernatural beings over nations. Have you ever asked where Daniel gets his theology? He gets it from Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9. And the outcome of all that at the eschaton is that all of those dudes are judged, done away with, destroyed, finally. The end of Psalm 82, the psalmist gets what he asks for. Oh God, rise up and take back the nations. That's accomplished in final form. It's accomplished in already but not yet form. In the epistles, we spend a lot of time on this stuff, but it's accomplished in final form. And you, as a believer, again, to those members of the churches John was writing to you, to those of you who overcome, who don't fall into unbelief, who don't go over to the other side, who remain steadfast in your believing loyalty to the gospel, you're going to inherit those nations. It's going to be you, not them. It's going to be you. So this is how Revelation 2 wraps up. And so for next time, we are going to wander into Revelation 3. We actually did a little of that today. But again, we can't help it because some of these themes repeat. But again, my goal is, to get substantially into Revelation 3. We might be able to get through the whole thing because there is some repetition. But this is what we're trying to do. When John is writing this stuff, what are the antecedents in the Old Testament? What is he doing theologically? How is he tying data points together to teach believers something, to warn them, and also to remind them, this world is not your home. This is what awaits you. Remain faithful, because if you don't, you're going to be destroyed with them, with the other side. It's for all the marvels. This is why you remain steadfast. You remain loyal to the gospel. You don't switch belief, your belief system, your belief commitment to anything else, especially, idolatry, worship of other gods. It is the foundational, fundamental thing that you don't do. Okay, you couldn't get any more clear in the Old Testament. Idolatry is the thing that separates you from God, and resistance to it, your loyalty to the true God, is the thing that makes you part of His family. It's point blank. It's fundamental. It's obvious when you think about it. And this is where John is going, and he wants them to come out on the right side.